This video is sponsored by Renderhub. Stick around to find amazing places where you can get high quality 3D models and also join an amazing community of 3D artists. So with Blender 5.0 just around the corner, let's take a look at some cool updates that we now have that will be coming to Blender. And of course, if you love to see new stuff, then you might want to stick around, as this is packed with a ton of new cool stuff that we'll be seeing with the final release of Blender 5.0. And with that said, let's dive right into it. This is 4.5 and this is 5.0. Of course, by face value, you're not going to notice a huge update with them. However, you will start noticing some things from the beginning. So if you simply pop open Blender and you go over to new, you will notice that this is what we have. We've got 5 different templates. Right here, we've got 6 different templates, and these templates now have their own icons. Another thing which you would notice is within the recent section, if you now click on more, you'll be able to have access to more files that you've recently opened. Contrary to the previous 20 which we had before, now you have a lot more options of files that you've recently opened. Looking all the way down, you would notice that the playhead looks pretty different from what we have previously. Another place where you get to notice some updates is when you go over to the color section. So within the color, you would notice we've got the linear and perpetual, contrary to what we have before, which is just the simple RGB and HSV. Right now, you can now toggle between linear and perpetual, and of course, you can play with the values and get some cool results. In several parts of Blender, you'd also notice a tiny tint or even hint of color. Seems like the Blender 5 series would be introducing more of icons and colors for more visual appeal. As in this case, you would notice that the keyframe has color, and this doesn't seem to have that right here. Another place where you'd notice colors is in the edit mode. So if you simply go over to the edit mode and select anything, say edges, vertices or faces, and right click, there is no color and no icon. Right here in 5.0, if you have any of these things selected and right click, you'd notice we've got a bit of color and we have some icons coming in. And these icons are not only here, as you get to notice new introduction of tiny little icons across Blender. Another interesting thing which you would notice is when you work with cameras. So for example, if we jump into this particular camera, we can simply go over to the viewport display, and from here we can choose to turn on things like the rule of thirds. Now, these doesn't seem to have anything that has to do with color, but in 5.0, you would be able to actually set that. So if we have that selected, and we go all the way to where we have our viewport display and go all the way down to composition guides, if we have this selected, we can actually change the color. So we can, specify a given color, and we can throw in as many cameras as we want and have them specify the kind of color that we are going for. And this is actually that tiny little quality of life improvement that you get to notice across every part of 5.0, which doesn't exist with previous versions of Blender. And of course, if you like to make a lot of modifications to your overall Blender scene, you can choose to do that within the theme setting, as the theme setting now has a ton of customization options that will definitely make you happy if you're into customizing themes. Now, before we proceed with more stuff that has to do with colors, let's talk about this cool stuff that is happening within the tools section. So if you go over to the tools section, you would notice that we have Workspace. Of course, this looks pretty similar to what you have with 4.5, as if you go over here and click on the drop down, you would see that. But things look a little bit different, because at this point, what we have within the workspace is the pin scenes and mode, whereas on this other hand, we have the pin scenes, the mode, the sequence scene, and the sync active scene. This is going to come in really handy later on down the line. And when we talk about the whole workspace thing, if we now go all the way to where we have our renders, and let's actually do that on this other side, if we scroll all the way down, you notice that within the color management, we only have the device, the view transform, look, exposure, gamma, sequencer, and we've got like display, high dynamic range display, curve, and white balance. In 5.0, that is a little bit more, because if we go all the way down and we click on color management, we have all those stuff, but then you would notice that we've also got working spaces. And within the working spaces, right here, we have the linear rec 709 and the linear rec 2020. At the same time, we also have the ACIS CG. And of course, you can select any of the ones that you want and click on apply, and that gets applied to your overall Blender working color space. And so this is going to do its best to match the color with any previous color stuff that you have inside of Blender. And this is available for both Eevee and of course cycles. Now, speaking about the engine type, you'll notice the cycles no longer have anything in form of experimental. That era is gone. In previous versions of Blender, if you switch over to cycles, you would notice that we've got feature set supported and experimental. That is no longer the case, as cycle has actually broken out of the experimental phase and everything is now feature set. In 5.0, you now have options for more modifiers. And before we talk about modifiers, here's something I think a lot of you guys may love. So by default, if you simply go through and create an object, and possibly you like to use a lattice modifier on that, you go over to your add menu and then you throw in a simple lattice modifier. This is basically how you work with it. In 5.0, you can now add a lattice to the object that you've got selected. So how you do that is have the object selected, hit Shift and A on the keyboard, go all the way to where you have the lattice, and you can now lattice deform the selected object. And with that, you have a tiny operator here which you can use to make modifications. And once you have this selected, you can press your tab key and modify this object however you want. So in this case, we like to just go ahead and modify this. We can actually go ahead and do that. And for those that might be thinking, can we add more subdivisions to this? Yes, you can, because once you have this selected, you can go over here and you can add as much subdivisions as you want. So in this case, once we have this ready, we can press the tab key, go in here, have that part and move it however we want. And you know, this is really cool. And more possibilities are also here with the new set of tools that we have. If we simply go ahead and make this a shaded smooth object and go over to the modifier section, if we click on the plus sign, within the generate section, you'll notice we now have a new array, a new curve to tube, and a scatter on surface. And these are not just the ones you have. You also have the instances. So first off, let's take a look at how we can play with the generate scatter, because I think this is one that a lot of people would love in terms of scattering things on surfaces. So for that, we've already gotten some botanic objects. So I'm just simply going to tap the period key so you can see that. So we can have all of these selected, press M on the keyboard, put them in a new collection, and I can just call this vegetation. So let's go ahead and call this vegetation. And so once we have that ready, we can click on OK, and now we have them in a container. So with this, once we have this selected, we can now go over here, go over to where we have generate and click on scatter on surface. You can choose to scatter by simply using individual objects, which we can definitely go ahead and do. So maybe if we just want to scatter one particular object, we can have just that object selected and it gets scattered on the surface, and we can increase the density however we want. Possibly if we like to play with the transformation based off how we like this thing to be scaled, we can of course go ahead and have all of this selected, maybe scale this all the way down like so, and maybe in most cases if you like to offset this, you can take this all the way up, bring that down, and you can simply do some quick randomization if you like to make some tiny offsets here and there. These allows you to do all of that. So we can increase that if we want and reduce it. On the other hand, if you like to use collections to actually drive this, what you can do is pretty simple. Have your collections selected, and in this case, we like to use the vegetation collection. So once we have that, we can also do the very same thing that we did earlier. So we can increase this if we want, and we can also reduce the overall scale. So we can go over to transform at this point, and we can simply drop this all the way down. At the same time, you have density and you also have amount. Within the amount section, you can increase the number of stuff that you want. So in this case, if we like to have number of stuff like this, we can of course go ahead and have all of that. And we can also choose to play with the density, and within the density, we do have different distribution methods, which is also available. So the folks at Blender have actually done something pretty impressive, as you can now simply use this to literally scatter anything in Blender. And it doesn't stop there. Despite the fact that you can do all of this scattering, you also have the masking. So within the masking section, we click on the plus sign and create a new mask. Now with this here, we can paint where we want things to be. So to do that, what we need to do is to go over to Object, go over to Texture Paint, and right here, you notice that this is basically what we have. and we can click on this button, click down here, click on single image, click on this plus sign, and we're going to select the veg mask. So this is the mask we would like to paint with, and from here we can start painting. So in this case, we're simply going to select the brush, tap N on the keyboard, go all the way to tools and switch the color from black to white and paint however we want. So you can simply use these to make some interesting paintings and art direct how you like your scatter to be. And once you're done with this, you can simply click right here, switch back to object mode, and you have yourself some nice scatter. At the same time, if you like to simply use parameters to drive this, you can of course go ahead and use parameters to drive this as well. So you can use some interesting parameters to get some stuff like this. Think it's just best to use the UV map because this is much more artistic and you have full control over it. The same thing can be said for the distribution mask as well. So you can also use a simple mask to drive that, or you can simply use parameters. And this is basically how you get it done. So for those who have been thinking about a scatter tool that they can work with, there is now one that is totally free that comes with Blender 5.0, and you can now knock yourself out with it. Now, with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at something else. Now, within the Generate section, we have the curve to tube. So for that, what we're going to do is to simply create a simple curve. So this is going to be a curve that the curve we would like to work with. I'm also going to make a copy of this and just bring it right here. And what we're going to do is to have this selected, click right here and go all the way to where we have curve to tube, and you have it. So this is something that I think we really needed. So a lot of times you might want to sweep a particular kind of profile and drive a curve based off that profile. You can now do it. So with this, I can decide to say maybe we would like to make this a little bit more of something like so. Maybe have these two selected, tap G on the keyboard, tap Z on the keyboard, move them all the way like that. Maybe that's the profile we want. We can now go in and use this to drive that. So if we go over to custom, we can click on this eyedropper and have that selected. And that way you have it. So you can play with the width, you can play with that. And this is basically what you'll be getting. And because this is fully procedural, you can literally go ahead and make some sweep modifications to this. So if you like to maybe change how this actually performs or maybe how it looks, you can of course go ahead and do all of that. And you can also make some modifications like this and just knock yourself out. And this looks pretty nice. So this is also one of those tools that is now available, or should I say one of those modifiers that now comes pre-packed with Blender 5.0. Another interesting thing, which I think a lot of creators would love, is this, having a brand new set of array right now in Blender. So for that one, what we're going to do is to simply go over to Generate and take a look at the brand new array system that is here. So contrary to what we had before, with this one, you now have full control. So you do have yourself a gizmo, which you can use to move things around, and you can actually increase the number of counts that you want. You do have a start and an end point, which is also pretty dope. So you can do stuff like this. You can move things around. You can, scale this however you want. You can raise them all the way up, change position, all of that stuff. So the array tool now works even better than expected. So possibly you like to make this a line, you can do that. If you're thinking about making this a circle, you can of course go ahead and do that and increase the radius. So we can increase the radius, increase the number of counts that we have. And of course, we can choose to push things in, push them out. You do have these nice gizmos that are now available with Blender, and you can literally control these just like you could do with tools like 3D Studio Max, Cinema 4D, and so on. On the other hand, we have the transform type, which is also pretty interesting. And with the transform type, you can actually create some interesting looking transforms with this. So possibly you like to make some more graphically styled stuff, you can choose to do that. For those who like to work with curve, this is one which is currently available. So for this, if you do have a curve and you like to use the curve to drive the array, you can have that going by selecting the curve and using that curve to drive the array. And this is saving you so much time. I mean, think about how much of the node work you have to do, because you simply go over to the geometry nodes, you would see how much nodes this is saving you. And outside that, there's also more assets that you can now work with if you go over to the asset browser, because right here, you do have to generate. We'll just explore these three. You can also play with the instances. So there is some cool stuff with the mesh right now, which includes the edge length, the face corner angle, all of these are currently available. Within the utilities, we've got different kinds of utility tools that are now available, and all of these assets are shipping with Blender 5.0. So you do have a ton of assets and also procedural node stuff that you can work with. Blender 5.0 also comes with some improved tooltip, contrary to what you have with Blender 4.5. And these can be seen across various parts of Blender. One part which you would definitely notice is when you're working within the geometry nodes and you're accessing the joint node. Now within the joint node, if you simply hover around, you will notice that you have a much more detailed, or should I say a much more descriptive tooltip, contrary to what you have with Blender 4.5. You'd also notice that the nodes that you have with 5.0 have a bit more beveled-like look when collapsed compared to the capsule-like look that 4.5 has. Amongst these, there's also something which is pretty nice called node switching. So by default, if I go in and say we connect the UV sphere to the output of these, if we would like to switch the node, say for example, we would like to switch this node, what we can now do 5.0 is to hit Shift and S on the keyboard, and I can type in the word grid and switch whatever node that I have here with a new one. In 4.5, that is not something that you can do. So I'm just simply going to go ahead and connect these right here. And if we tap Shift and S, that doesn't seem to pop open. But in 5.0, you can definitely change that, because in certain cases, you might just want to replace one particular node with another, and you can absolutely do that. And one place which this is also going to come in very handy is when you're working with the Compositor. So first off, within the Compositor, you would notice that the Use node is no longer there. So in 4.5, we have the Use node. In 5.0, you have the New node. So you can click on the plus sign to add a new node. So in this case, if we simply throw in the new node, you can get the hue, saturation, and value, throw that in there, and make this change. Now, in certain cases, if you don't see this reflect on your viewport, all you need to do is to simply go right here, click on this drop down, and you need to turn on either camera or always. Camera if you like this to affect the camera, always if you like whatever change you have here to affect it on the viewport, whether you're within the camera view or not. So where the swap node comes in very handy in this regard is if in case you no longer need the hue, saturation, and value, possibly you need the Kuwahara, which is a pretty nice one, you can hit Shift and S on the keyboard, click on search and type Kuwahara, and then you can get that filter to automatically replace the one that you have previously. And these also work with multiple nodes as well. So if you do have multiple nodes, you can have all of them selected and you can swap them for other nodes too. Something else that we saw that was teased within the Blender conference was the fact that we'll be getting assets. The asset panel has been made ready, but we don't have those assets yet. Hopefully, this will be shipping with the final release of Blender 5.0. But for what it's worth, it is nice to see that we'll have the asset dock ready to go, and this promises a lot of things. Something else that is also quite promising is the handshake between the Compositor and the video sequence editor. And this is something that I think a lot of creators would love, especially if you work with tools like DaVinci Resolve, where you have a good handshake with the editor alongside Fusion, which is the node section. And that is what I think the folks at Blender are currently doing with this. In this case, we do have our video sequence editor, and from here, for us to actually get this going to Compositor, we need to go over to modifiers. Now you notice that the modifier is now slightly different from what we previously used to have. From here, if we click on add modifier, we can have a lot of other modifiers added, and right here, you'd notice that we have Compositor. So if we have this selected, we can now simply drag this all the way out and switch this to our Compositor. We can now go here and click on new. And once we do that, automatically, if we click down here, you would notice that we have the sequencer Compositor nodes. So from here, if you like to do the hue, saturation, and stuff that we did earlier, you can actually go ahead and throw that in. Of course, you can make changes like so. And if you like to throw in any of those effects, you can now simply do all of that. Now, one thing you need to keep in mind is this is not as real time as you might expect, because the more filters you throw in, this would now have to cache them. So in simple cases like this is going to possibly respond a bit faster compared to where you throw in a bit more complex effect like this one. The response time is not going to be as 100% because, it has to cache before you'll be able to actually get it playing back. Other than that, this actually works as expected, and you can proceed to do some masking, and this is pretty amazing. And while we talk about amazing stuff, there is something I guess a lot of you guys possibly missed when we talked about the nice new templates that are now available in Blender. And you would find that if you simply go over to File, New, here, it's called Storyboarding. And this is something that we mentioned that Tom said will be coming to Blender 5. And the storyboarding scene is a combination of what you have with the sequencer alongside the grease pencil. And how this works is extremely easy. So for example, if we draw B right here and we go over here, switch these to the draw tool and right L, you'll notice that we can flip between two shots, the first shot and the second shot. And these two are being recorded. So for example, we come over to frame 6 and we type in A, for example, you would notice that it still stores it as B and A. So this whole strip can have a lot of information, and we can go over to the next shot and make even more information. So we can say maybe 3 different actions happens inside one shot, and we can also have multiple actions happen inside another shot. So we can do, BLA, for example, and we have that, and you notice that this is being keyframed. BLA, maybe B right here as well. So we can have that as well. And you can have these going on and on. So you can make as many shots as you want, which is in relation to the storyboard that you're building, alongside making several drawings in relation to those shots that you are working on. And that is basically the whole idea of this. Of course, this is still pretty new. It is still growing, but potentially this will get to the point where it will become a much more standard tool that lots of creators will be able to use for their storyboarding. And with that said, there's a couple cool features which is also available with this, and you can go ahead and explore them. And because this is also with the sequencer, you can definitely have any of these shots selected, go over to your modifier, and you can do any of those stuff that you have with your default sequencer in here. Now, if this is going to change, that is something we have no idea as at yet, but potentially this is what it is, and this is what Blender 5.0 might be shipping with. And for the shader nodes, there's a couple of cool things that are now happening here. First off, we've got the menu switching. Just like what we have previously with geometry nodes, at this point you can now switch between menus right inside of the shader editor. It's also worth mentioning that, like we have with the geometry nodes, shaders now support closures and bundles. And I've already talked about this one previously and actually gone through the whole blog post, and I'm also going to link that in the description for those who like to work with it. Repeat zone, like in geometry nodes, is also available in shader nodes as well, as Blender 5.0 seems to be working towards unifying the whole node system that exists in Blender. And currently, with the repeat zone, only a fixed number of iterations are supported. And if you like to get multiple iterations, you may need to duplicate the node, and this is planned to be improved in the future. The viewer node has now been updated to support viewing non-geometry data. Additionally, this now supports a dynamic number of input values. In terms of tangents, there is now a new tangent node which gives access to tangent vectors on any mesh. And by default, these just simply outputs tangents based off the Mgt space library, and these tangents are super compatible with Blender, especially for those working with different render engines. And just like we mentioned before, we're getting more and more several new updates to the node group assets that will be shipping with Blender. And speaking about assets, there is an update to the asset bundle, as this has been updated with a new community contribution of a skeleton. This is a realistic skeleton. For those who like to get this particular skeleton from the asset demo file, you might want to simply go over to the link in the description. That's going to bring you right here, where you'll be able to download the Human Base Meshes version 1.4.0. And this comes with realistic and stylized characters alongside head-based meshes that you can use to kickstart your sculpting or your character development process. Some other things that you get to find is multiple group input node can now be joined by simply using Ctrl-J. That is pretty interesting. And there's also conversations of new and reworked viewport matcaps, as at the time of recording, with the version of Blender 5.0, the alpha that we're playing with, those matcaps are not yet reflected, but hopefully we'll be seeing more and more matcaps in Blender. So this is it. Blender 5.0 will be coming with a lot of things. And speaking of working with cool stuff, for those who are looking for amazing 3D models, assets, and also inspiring artworks, then you can simply go over to Renderhub, where you'll be able to find a ton of these. The folks at Renderhub have an amazing gallery of 3D content that you can take advantage of, and at the same time, you'll be able to buy, sell, and even download free 3D models right on their platform. They also have an amazing learning hub where you'll be able to learn cool stuff that has to do with Blender. Also, if you're in the spirit of competition, you might want to consider taking a look at the Renderhub Horrific Render Contest version 4, and this is running from now till 31st of October 2025. With a price value of $2,650, you will be able to stand the chance of winning this. Terms and conditions to this alongside deliverables are also available, and I'm going to put links to this one in the description. So in case you're thinking about a place where you can get free 3D models, learn from creators, buy or even sell your own 3D assets and artworks, then Renderhub is the perfect place for you. So this is it. Tell me what you guys think about this one in the comment section, and until I see you guys in the next one, peace.